With me now to discuss from the Heritage Foundation, Hans von Spakovsky. Hans, good to see you.
Good night. Nice to be back with you.
All right, Hans. So a couple questions, but start out here with the proof, the evidence that this would be not just isolated incidents, which still violate the integrity of some person's vote somewhere, but what's the evidence that this would lead to larger scale or widespread fraud?
Well, it's not just fraud, but it's also the fact that the U.S. mail service is not very good about delivering these kind of ballots. But, I mean, all Twitter has to do, the folks at Twitter, is look at what's going on right now in Paterson, New Jersey. They switched to an all-mail election for their municipal elections that they had a couple of weeks ago, and the elections are now in doubt. 4 people have already been arrested for criminal voter fraud. There are allegations and evidence of everything from ballots being stolen out of mailboxes to the fact that 20%, 1 in 5 ballots, have been rejected by election officials for, among other things, the signatures not matching on the ballots coming in and the signatures of the voters on file, which is an indication that someone else may have forged and filled out that ballot.
Right. And I think that's a really important point, too. So if there's a system that's inadequate or a government entity like the post office that's incompetent, this can in itself lead to a vulnerability for voter fraud, because once people who would commit fraud realize that vulnerability, they can either exploit it, take advantage of it, and commit a crime, or we're left with this situation where the integrity of people's ballots are in question, whether you have to decide, well, do we accept a ballot without a signature when that could have been fraudulent, or do we disenfranchise a voter who did everything correct but the post office messed it up? I mean, it's called wisdom, I think, and prudence and foresight to look at these things before we make a policy widespread. I don't quite understand why the Democrats are ignoring this vulnerability. I mean, it's almost as if they want this fraud to actually happen to ruin an election before they're going to be willing to look at it.
Yeah, it's as if they want to make it easier to cheat and easier to manipulate election results. I mean, look, to just give you another recent example that Twitter is ignoring, the Inspector General of the U.S. Postal Service just released a report on the literally thousands of ballots that were found, mail-in ballots in Wisconsin. Remember, they had a primary on April 7th. They found that 3,500 ballots had never been delivered to voters. They also found hundreds of ballots also that had not been postmarked. And so election officials couldn't accept them because they didn't know if the ballots had been mailed after the election. That's so recent. How can Twitter ignore those kind of examples of the problems with mail-in balloting?
Well, I think the answer, of course, is purely political. It's ideology. There's no other answer.
Right.
Here's a question, though, that both sides should be able to have a dialogue about. This is the actual conversation we should have. Is there a way to do mail-in voting while protecting against fraud? And if so, what are the measures that need to be implemented to make sure that incompetence or lack of resources or crime does not impact the integrity of the votes if we were to cast them via mail-in ballots?
Well, we can have a discussion that way, but folks on the left aren't willing to listen to that. I mean, to go back to something you mentioned, which is vote harvesting. Look, at the same time that progressive groups have been pushing for an all-mail election, they've been pushing to override state laws that ban vote harvesting. What vote harvesting means is that the state allows any stranger to come to your front door to pick up your ballot to deliver it to election officials. That means candidates, campaign staffers, political activists, people who have a stake in the outcome will be handling your ballot. And why in the world would they want something like that to be occurring when supposedly we have to move to all-mail elections because of the COVID-19 crisis? Yet they're pushing to allow strangers to go door to door, to show up at your front door to pick up your ballot, which sounds like a very sure way to spread COVID-19.
Well, it also sounds like vulnerability for fraud. I mean, in multiple ways. There was a case in Texas. This was a tried case. The people were convicted of what's called ballot piracy. They intercepted mail-in ballots, filled them out themselves, and then forced elderly people to sign them. That is voter fraud. That has happened. That is a form of ballot harvesting. The video that we were just showing, the B-roll beside you as you were talking there, that was a girl in California who was a political operative who went door to door offering to return people's mail-in ballots to their polling place, but only if the voters were Democrats. In North Carolina, a Republican candidate dropped out of his race because he cheated. He engaged in ballot harvesting when it's against the law in North Carolina, and there was every reason to believe that he had falsified, or it appeared that he had falsified these ballots because they were more than a majority were for him compared to the non-mail-in ballots in that same district. It's ripe for fraud. And like I said, I don't understand people who don't think ahead. You want to prevent this before it happens, not wreck an election by allowing it to take place.
You know, what's so odd about this, Liz, is that 8 years ago, the New York Times actually published an article about the problems with mail-in ballots. And part of their conclusion was that mail-in ballots are more vulnerable to everything from being stolen to having much higher rates of rejection by election officials, something that doesn't happen with in-person voting.
Well, I think that's what the Democrats typically call disenfranchising a voter. If there's a particular method of voting that reduces the likelihood of your vote being counted, that is known as disenfranchising a voter. That's what mail-in ballots will do, make no mistake. Hans, thank you for being on top of this. I appreciate it.